What if the outcome of an air battle wasn't decided by generals, engineers, or official doctrine, but by a single mechanic who was never supposed to touch strategy at all? At dawn on a humid Pacific airfield, pilots were climbing into aircraft they secretly believed were killing them. Losses were climbing, confidence was collapsing, and every official explanation pointed to pilot error. But on the ground, beneath the wings and inside the metal skeleton of those planes, someone saw a problem. No briefing ever mentioned. And what he did next quietly rewrote the rules of that battle. From the outside, everything looked normal. Engines roared. Propellers spun. Crews followed checklists, written thousands of miles away. Yet pilots kept reporting the same feeling in combat. The aircraft hesitated at the exact moment hesitation meant death. In high-speed engagements, fractions of a second decided whether you escaped or burned. Enemy fighters seemed to anticipate every move, cutting inside turns, exploiting delays that should not have existed. Official doctrine blamed stress, inexperience, or poor tactics. The manuals insisted the aircraft was fine. Statistics said otherwise. Every morning, the mechanic watched young pilots walk toward their planes with forced confidence. Some would not return. He listened to debriefings filled with frustration and disbelief. Pilots described the same thing again and again. The controls felt slow, almost heavy when maneuvering hard. Not broken, not obviously defective, just slow enough to be fatal. To engineers, everything remained within acceptable tolerances. To the men flying, those tolerances were killing them. The mechanic had no authority to question doctrine. He wasn't trained to redesign aircraft or rewrite combat tactics. His job was simple: keep planes airworthy. But he worked with his hands, not theories. He felt the machines. He noticed tiny details others ignored. While officers trusted specifications, he trusted patterns. And the pattern was clear. The enemy wasn't superior because of better pilots alone. They were exploiting a hidden weakness. Inside the aircraft's control system, there was a small amount of slack, officially acceptable, practically invisible. In training, it meant nothing. In combat, under extreme stress and violent maneuvers, it created a delay between intention and action. That delay was enough for the enemy to predict movements, cut angles, and win turn-in fights they should not have won. No report mentioned it. No tests simulated it. But in the sky, it was happening every day. The mechanic understood something crucial. War doesn't happen in laboratories. It happens in chaos, fear, and milliseconds. A flaw that looks irrelevant on paper becomes catastrophic under fire. He also understood the risk. Modifying a control system without authorization wasn't just against regulations. It could mean court-martial, prison, the end of his career. Worse, if he was wrong, he could kill a pilot with his own hands. Yet doing nothing meant watching the same story repeat. Another briefing, another funeral, another explanation that solved nothing. So he made a decision no manual allowed, using a simple, improvised fix, something so small it would never appear in official documentation. He altered the behavior of the aircraft. It wasn't a new weapon. It wasn't advanced technology. It was a mechanical adjustment born from observation, not theory. The kind of fix that only comes from someone who lives inside the machine, not above it. The aircraft rolled out the next morning looking identical to every other one on the flight line. No markings, no announcement, no approval. The pilot climbed in, unaware that anything had changed. But the first time he engaged the enemy, something felt different. The aircraft responded instantly. No hesitation, no delay. The fight unfolded faster, sharper, more aggressively, and for the first time in weeks, the pilot came back alive with a story that didn't end in frustration. What's happened next would ripple far beyond a single swing. Without orders, without meetings, without signatures, a forbidden idea began moving quietly through the airfield. Mechanics talked. Pilots noticed. Enemy tactics started failing for reasons they couldn't explain. Los ratios shifted. Confidence returned, and somewhere in the chaos of war, a battle changed course without anyone officially admitting why. If this opening already changed the way you look at air combat, take a second to pause and really think about what just happened here. This wasn't a new aircraft, a new weapon, or a new doctrine approved by high command. It was understanding. It was seeing a problem, others ignored, and daring to act on it. That's why it's so important to truly understand stories like this, not just hear them. When you understand how wars actually change, you start seeing history in a completely different way. So let me ask you something. How many battles do you think were decided not by generals, but by people whose names never appeared in official reports? Drop a comment below with your thoughts, or even just write the word understood if this already made you see the war from a new angle. That kind of engagement tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover it. And if you appreciate deep, real military history told through the moments that actually changed outcomes, hit the like button and make sure you subscribed to the channel. These stories don't survive unless people actively choose to keep them alive. The enemy's advantage didn't come from better engines, superior weapons, or some secret technology hidden in plain sight. On paper, the aircraft on both sides looked evenly matched, sometimes even favoring the pilots who were losing. Speed, altitude, firepower, all the metrics commanders loved to compare suggested parity. And yet, in real combat, one side consistently dictated how fights unfolded. Pilots felt it before they could explain it. They entered engagements already reacting, already behind the tempo, already playing defense in a sky that punished hesitation. The key advantage was invisible because it wasn't a weapon at all. It was timing, more specifically. Control timing. Air combat at close range isn't about who turns tighter on paper. It's about who initiates movement first and who finishes it faster. In a turning fight, the aircraft that responds a fraction of a second soon gains positional dominance. That dominance compounds rapidly. One delayed roll leads to a wider arc. A wider arc exposes the fuselage. Exposure invites gunfire, and gunfire ends the fight. Enemy pilots understood this intuitively. They weren't just skilled flyers. They were hunters trained to read micro-responses. They watched how an opponent's aircraft reacted to sudden reversals. They noticed slight delays, subtle lag between stick movement and airframe response. Once identified, that delay became a target. They baited it. They exploited it. They built their entire engagement around forcing opponents into situations where that weakness mattered most. Official doctrine never accounted for this. Training manuals assumed ideal conditions. They assumed immediate control response. They assumed combat followed predictable envelopes. But real dogfights happened at the edge of physics, where tolerances stopped being acceptable and started being lethal. The enemy didn't need to outfly everyone. They just needed to know exactly when their opponent's aircraft would hesitate. This is why so many pilots came back with the same story. Even though no one compared notes officially, they all felt the aircraft drag for an instant during aggressive maneuvers. Not enough to ground it, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to lose initiative in the air. Initiative is life. Lose it once, and you're defending. Lose it twice, and you're dead. Enemy pilots built confidence. Around the Z, they pressed attacks, knowing their opponent would react late. They committed to maneuvers others would consider reckless because experience had taught them those maneuvers worked. Over time, this confidence became psychological dominance. Pilots who expect to win take more risks. Pilots who expect to lose hesitate. That hesitation fed the cycle, reinforcing the enemy's edge even further. Commanders tried to solve the problem at the wrong level. They adjusted formations. They rewrote tactics. They blamed pilot discipline. None of it worked because none of it addressed the actual cause. You cannot doctrine your way out of a mechanical delay. You cannot train reflexes faster than a machine allows. The enemy wasn't winning because they were braver or smarter. They were winning because they were flying against an aircraft that betrayed its pilots at the worst possible moment. What made this advantage especially dangerous was how hard it was to prove. Engineers tested aircraft under controlled conditions. Everything checked out. Inspectors measured values that fell neatly inside specification ranges. No red flags appeared. The flaw only revealed itself in violent, high stress. Life or death. Maneuvers, exactly the conditions. Engineers rarely replicated on the ground, so the advantage stayed invisible, growing deadlier with every engagement. And that's why the mechanic mattered. While officers studied reports and engineers trusted tolerances, someone on the grounds was watching patterns instead of numbers. He didn't need to name the advantage to understand it. He just needed to recognize that the enemy wasn't faster. They were earlier. They weren't stronger. They were quicker to act. And that realization set the stage for a decision that would never appear in any manual. The mechanic wasn't supposed to matter in this story. He wasn't in the briefing room. He didn't sit at the strategy table. His name wasn't T, written on flight rosters or victory boards. Officially, his role ended the moment the aircraft left the runway. But wars are not decided only by the people who give orders. They are decided by the people who notice what everyone else walks past. He spent his days where pilots rarely looked under wings, inside access panels, kneeling on hot metal with grease on his hands and sweat in his eyes. While officers discussed tactics and engineers trusted diagrams, he listened to machines. He felt vibrations. He noticed resistance in cables, the way components behaved when pushed to their limits. To him, aircraft weren't symbols of power or national pride. They were systems, and systems always told the truth. If you paid attention long enough, every morning followed the same ritual. Pilots approached their aircraft trying to look confident. Jokes were forced. Smiles didn't reach their eyes. The mechanic watched them climb into cockpits, knowing some of them wouldn't come back. When planes returned damaged, he was there first. When they didn't, he returned at all. He was the one who helped clear the empty space on the flight line. He started noticing something others dismissed as coincidence. The same types of damage, the same angles of impact, the same complaints during debriefings. Pilots used different words, but the meaning was identical. The aircraft didn't respond fast enough when it mattered most. Not broken, not malfunctioning, just late. To officers, this sounded like stress or combat fatigue. To engineers, it sounded like imagination. To the mechanic, It sounded like a pattern. He didn't need combat experience to understand the implications. He understood machines under stress. He knew that what worked fine during testing could fail subtly under extreme conditions. Specifications were written for safety and durability, not for survival in knife-edge combat, and the enemy, whoever they were facing in the air, clearly understood that gap. The mechanic began checking the same components repeatedly. Control cables, linkages, pulleys, everything measured correctly. Everything passed inspection. But when he moved the controls by hand, slowly and then suddenly, he felt it a slight delay before resistance built. A fraction of movement where nothing happened. Tiny, officially acceptable, practically invisible. He tested it again and again. Compared aircraft, compared older airframes to newer ones. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to alarm anyone who wasn't looking for it. But once you noticed it, you couldn't unfeel it. And once you understood how air combat worked, you couldn't ignore what that delay meant. Pilots trusted him in ways they didn't trust reports. They came to him quietly, away from officers, asking questions they didn't dare ask officially. Does this plane feel different to you? Is it just me, or does it hesitate when I pull hard? He never gave them dramatic answers. He didn't need to. He just listened. And every conversation reinforced the same conclusion. The mechanic understood something crucial that doctrine missed. In combat, confidence is mechanical. Pilots don't hesitate because they are afraid. They hesitate because their aircraft teaches them to. When a machine delays response, the pilot subconsciously compensates. He anticipates lag. He flies defensively. That hesitation becomes habit. The enemy senses it immediately. This mechanic wasn't reckless. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He didn't believe he was smarter than engineers. But he understood context. Engineers designed aircraft for production and reliability. He lived with those aircraft at the edge of destruction, and in that space between design and reality, he saw the truth. He also understood the cost of acting. Unauthorized modifications weren't a minor infraction. They were a career-ending offense. If something failed, he would be blamed, not the system. And yet, doing nothing meant accepting that the same invisible flaw would keep killing pilots who trusted him to keep their aircraft safe. This wasn't a moment of inspiration. It was a slow, uncomfortable realization that no one else was going to fix this. Not because they didn't care, but because the system wasn't built to see it. And when systems fail, individuals are forced to choose between rules and responsibility. The flaw wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cracked metal, leaking fuel, or a failed engine. It was the kind of problem that hides inside the margins of engineering charts, buried under words like acceptable tolerance and within specification. On paper, it was nothing. In the air, it was lethal. Inside the aircraft's control system, the path between the pilot's hands and the control surfaces wasn't perfectly rigid. It couldn't be. Cables ran through pulleys, bends, and guides. Metal flexed. Materials expanded with heat and vibration. To account for this, designers allowed a small amount of slack in the system. That slack prevented binding, reduced wear, and kept controls smooth under normal conditions. In training flights, it was harmless. In level flight, it was invisible. But combat was never normal. In a high-speed turning fight, pilots weren't making gentle inputs. They were slamming controls to their limits, reversing direction violently, forcing the aircraft to obey instantly or die. In those moments, that tiny slack became a delay. Not seconds, not even tenths, just a fraction of a second where the pilot moved the stick and nothing happened. Yet, that fraction was everything. Air combat at close range is a chain reaction. One pilot initiates a roll, the other reacts. Whoever finishes the movement first controls the geometry of the fight. A delayed response widens the turn radius. A wider radius exposes the aircraft's side profile. Side profile invites gunfire. Once rounds start hitting, recovery is unlikely. Enemy pilots learned this quickly. They didn't need to know the mechanical reason. They only needed to recognize the behavior. They watched American aircraft hesitate at the start of aggressive maneuvers. They timed their reversals perfectly, knowing the opponent's plane would lag just long enough to fall behind. What looked like superior skill was in many cases superior exploitation of a flaw. The most dangerous part was how inconsistent it felt. Sometimes the delay was barely noticeable. Other times, under maximum stress, it became pronounced. That inconsistency made pilots doubt themselves. Was it the aircraft? Was it their timing? Were they overreacting? Self-doubt is poison in combat. A pilot who doesn't trust his aircraft hesitates even more, compounding the problem. Engineers couldn't reproduce this on the ground. Static tests showed nothing wrong. Control inputs measured correctly. Cable tension sat neatly within approved ranges. No alarms triggered. No checklist item failed. The flaw only appeared when multiple factors aligned. High speed, extreme control inputs, aerodynamic loading, and life or death. Urgency. Exactly the environment engineers avoided during testing. The mechanic understood this intuitively. He didn't need formulas to see it. He felt it every time he tested the controls by hand, snapping them hard instead of moving them gently. He felt the moment of dead travel before resistance engaged. He realized that what engineers saw as safety margin, pilots experienced as betrayal. And this wasn't just one aircraft. It was systemic, built into the design philosophy, replicated across an entire fleet. Every pilot was flying with the same invisible handicap, and the enemy had already figured it out. That realization changed everything. This wasn't a training issue. It wasn't pilot discipline. It wasn't tactics. It was mechanical reality colliding with combat physics, and no amount of briefings would fix it. Only one thing could: removing the delay. But removing it meant violating the very rules designed to keep aircraft safe. Tightening control systems beyond specification risked wear, stress, even failure under long-term use. From an engineering perspective, the rules made sense. From a combat perspective, they were killing people now. The flaw was tiny. The consequences were not. And standing alone on the flight line, staring at an aircraft that would be airborne again in hours, the mechanic understood the brutal truth. If this flaw remained, more pilots would die. If he acted, he might end his career or someone's life. There was no safe choice, only a necessary one. That's when the line was crossed. The decision didn't come with drama or speeches. There was no moment of heroism, no declaration of defiance. It happened quietly, late in the day, when the flight line emptied and the noise faded. The kind of moment where choices are made without witnesses, because the person making them already understands the consequences. The mechanic knew exactly what he was about to do. He also knew exactly why no one else would do it. Regulations existed for a reason. Aircraft were mass-produced, flown by thousands of pilots, maintained by crews with varying skill levels. Unauthorized changes introduced unknown risks. If something failed, responsibility wouldn't fall on a distant engineer or a faceless system. It would fall on the man who touched the machine. And yet, every regulation assumed peacetime logic applied cleanly to wartime reality. It assumed problems could be reported, analyzed, approved, and fixed through proper channels. The sky didn't wait for paperwork. Pilots didn't get a second chance while committees debated tolerances. Combat exposed flaws faster than any test program ever could. The mechanic didn't believe he was smarter than the engineers. He believed he was closer to the problem. Engineers designed for averages. He worked with extremes. They planned for durability over thousands of hours. He was dealing with seconds that decided life or death. He started small. Not a redesign. Not a permanent alteration. A simple adjustment. Something reversible. Something subtle enough to escape casual inspection. The goal wasn't to change the aircraft's identity. Only its behavior at the exact moment it mattered most. As he worked, he felt the weight of the risk pressing down on him. If the controls bound up in flight, if the stress damaged components, if a pilot lost control even once, the blame would be absolute. There would be no defense. Within specification would suddenly matter. Very much. But another thought kept returning, sharper than fear. Doing nothing guaranteed more funerals. He thought about the pilots he'd spoken to quietly, the ones who asked questions with eyes that already knew the answer. He thought about the empty spaces on the flight line where aircraft never returned. He thought about how the enemy seemed to know exactly when American planes would hesitate, and he understood that waiting for permission was itself a decision, one that favored the status quo, and the status quo was killing people, so he crossed the line. The modification took minutes, not hours. No new parts stamped with serial numbers. No diagrams updated, just a mechanical correction guided by instinct and experience. When he finished, the aircraft looked exactly the same. No one walking past would notice a difference. Even an inspection wouldn't immediately reveal it unless someone knew where to look. He tested the controls by hand, hard, fast. The response was immediate. No dead space. No hesitation. The aircraft answered the input the moment it was given. It felt alive in a way it hadn't before. That feeling terrified him because now there was no turning back. The aircraft would fly. The pilot would trust it, and whatever happened next would prove him right or destroy him completely. He didn't tell anyone what he had done. Not the pilot, not his supervisor, not another mechanic. Silence was protection for himself and for the pilot. If the change failed, fewer people would be implicated. If it worked, the results would speak louder than explanations ever could. The aircraft rolled out for its next mission like every other one before it. Same markings, same roar of engines, same checklist. But hidden inside, the rules had been broken. What followed would determine whether this act of quiet rebellion was reckless, sabotage, or the beginning of something that would spread far beyond one machine and one man. The first combat after the modification didn't begin with a dramatic announcement or a sense of destiny. It began like every other mission, engines warming, crews moving with practiced routine, pilots sealing themselves into cockpits they had learned not to trust completely. No one on the flight line knew that anything had changed. The aircraft carried the same scars, the same weight, the same expectations. Only one thing was different. and it was invisible. As the aircraft climbed toward altitude, the pilot felt nothing unusual. Straight and level flight never revealed the flaw, and it never revealed the fix either. The real test only came when the sky turned hostile. The enemy appeared ahead, exactly as intelligence predicted. Formation tight. Approach disciplined. This was the moment pilots dreaded, the instant where reaction time meant survival. As the opposing fighters closed, the pilot instinctively prepared for the familiar delay, the subtle lag he had learned to anticipate. His hands moved, expecting resistance to arrive. Lachi, it didn't. The aircraft responded immediately. Not faster than physics allowed, faster than memory expected. The roll began. The instant a stick moved, the nose followed cleanly, sharply, without the dead space that had haunted every previous engagement. For a split second, the pilot thought they imagined it. Then the fight accelerated. The enemy attempted the same maneuver that had worked countless times before, baiting a turn, forcing a reversal, waiting for hesitation. But the hesitation never came. The geometry collapsed, angles closed too quickly. What should have been a predictable exchange turned chaotic for the attacker instead. The pilot didn't analyze it in the moment. There was no time. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. The aircraft went where he wanted it to go, exactly when he wanted it to go there. The fight became aggressive instead of defensive. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't reacting, he was initiating. The enemy broke formation early. That alone was unusual. Their confidence evaporated mid-approach, as if something fundamental had shifted without explanation. The pilot pressed the advantage instinctively, exploiting openings that never existed before. A burst of fire forced a break. Another pass disrupted coordination. The sky, once controlled by the enemy's timing, suddenly felt open. When the engagement ended, the aircraft was still intact. The pilot was alive. And something even more important had changed. His confidence. Not bravado. Trust. Trust that when he moved, the aircraft would obey him, not betray him. Back on the ground, the mechanic watched the aircraft roll in. No damage. No emergency signals. Just another landing. Except this one came with a pilot who climbed out of the cockpit differently. Slower, more focused. Eyes scanning the aircraft as if seeing it for the first time. The pilot didn't say much at first. He didn't need to. Experienced men recognize moments that don't require explanation. He simply said the controls felt right. Immediate, predictable, alive. That single sentence mattered more than any report. Word didn't spread through announcements. It spread through behavior. Pilots who flew the modified aircraft returned differently. They didn't talk about luck. They talked about control. Other pilots noticed. They asked questions quietly. Mechanics listened. Patterns began to form. The enemy noticed. 2 subsequent engagements followed the same strange script. Fighters that once pressed attacks now hesitated. Maneuvers that should have trapped the aircraft failed unexpectedly. The timing the enemy relied on no longer worked. Their confidence, built on predictable reactions, began to fracture. What made this moment dangerous was how invisible the change remained. Commanders saw improved results, but no obvious cause. Engineers saw no official modifications. Reports showed better survivability without explaining why. The war machine absorbed the results without understanding the source, and that created a new tension. Because if this worked once, it would work again. And if it worked again, someone would eventually notice. Not just the improvement, the deviation. Rules would collide with results. Authority would confront reality. For now, though, the change lived in the shadows. One aircraft at a time, one mission at a time, quietly reshaping the fight without permission. The enemy felt the change before they understood it. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence, a good pilot, a lucky maneuver, an engagement that simply didn't unfold as planned. But air combat is a discipline built on patterns, and when patterns break repeatedly, experienced pilots notice what had once been reliable suddenly wasn't. For months, their tactics had worked with brutal consistency. They knew when to commit, when to reverse, when to force an opponent into a losing geometry. Timing was everything, and timing had always been on their side. Now, without warning, the timing was slipping away. Maneuvers that once guaranteed advantage ended in confusion. Attacks that should have been decisive dissolved into chaos. Enemy pilots began reporting something unsettling. The aircraft they were engaging no longer hesitated. Reversals came faster. Turns tightened unexpectedly. The familiar delay they had learned to exploit was gone. Some described it as flying against a different machine. Others said it felt like the same aircraft, but piloted by men who suddenly anticipated everything. That uncertainty was dangerous. Confidence in air combat is as lethal as firepower. When pilots stop trusting their instincts, they hesitate. When they hesitate, they lose initiative. The enemy had built their dominance on certainty. Certainty about how the opposing aircraft would respond. That certainty was now attempts to adapt came quickly. Some pilots grew more aggressive, trying to overwhelm with speed and proximity, assuming the change was temporary. That only made things worse. Aggression without control led them into tighter envelopes where the new responsiveness of the opposing aircraft punished mistakes instantly. Others became cautious, breaking off attacks earlier, refusing to commit to turning fights that once favored them. Both reactions carried a cost. Aggression increased losses. Caution seeded the sky. Reports filtered up the chain of command describing unexpected aircraft behavior and unreliable engagement. Outcomes. Intelligence officers reviewed these reports and found nothing tangible. No new aircraft models had appeared. No visible external modifications were observed. Wreckage analysis revealed nothing unusual. From their perspective, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The psychological impact spread faster than any official response pilots talked. Stories circulated. A sense of doubt crept in. When a tactic stops working without explanation, it undermines more than undermines belief. Pilots who once pressed attacks now questioned their assumptions mid-fight. That hesitation was enough. The most dangerous realization for the enemy was this. The change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't something they could counter easily. You can adapt to a new weapon. You can study a new aircraft. But how do you adapt to something you can't see? Something that exists only in fractions of a second. They began searching for answers in the wrong places. Training adjustments, formation changes, new briefing guidance. None addressed the core problem. The enemy wasn't being outflown by superior tactics. They were being outtimed by a machine that no longer behaved the way they expected. And that made the situation worse with every engagement. Each failed attack reinforced uncertainty. Each loss confirmed that the old rules no longer applied. Pilots who survived encounters returned shaken, unable to explain what had gone wrong. It should have worked became a common phrase in air combat should have as another word for defeat. Meanwhile, the change remained unofficial. There were no memos, no acknowledgments, no recognition of what was happening on the other side of the fight. The enemy sensed a shift in the balance of power, but couldn't locate its source. They were fighting an opponent who had quietly stepped outside the rules without announcing it. And that is how wars often turn, not with a single overwhelming blow, but with the slow collapse of certainty. When one side no longer understands the battlefield, every decision becomes riskier. Every action carries doubt, and doubt in combat is contagious. As this confusion spread through enemy ranks, the quiet modification on the ground began to move as well, from one aircraft to another, from one mechanic to the next, without orders, without approval, without stopping. The idea didn't spread like an official upgrade. There were no briefings, no diagrams passed around, no signatures authorizing change. It moved the way forbidden knowledge always does in war, quietly, informally, carried by results instead of words. Pilots talk, not in reports, but in glances, in short comments after landing, in the way they describe a fight when they think no one important is listening. This one felt different. The controls responded instantly. I didn't have to anticipate the turn. Those phrases began appearing again and again, attached to the same aircraft, the same maintenance crews. Mechanics noticed it first. They watched which planes came back intact. They noticed which pilots stopped complaining about hesitation. They saw patterns the command structure wasn't designed to track. One aircraft surviving could be luck. 2 could be coincidence. 5 returning from repeated engagements without damage was something else. The questions started quietly. One mechanic asking another what had been done differently. A pilot requesting a specific aircraft for his next sortie. Someone staying late on the flight line, watching a colleague work, memorizing small movements without asking why. Nothing was written down. Nothing official changed, but the modification began to replicate itself. Each time it happened, the same calculation played out. Break the rules and improve survival, or follow regulations and accept the losses. Most didn't see it as rebellion. They saw it as responsibility. When you watch men die from a flaw you can fix, obedience starts to feel like negligence. The spread was careful. No one modified every aircraft at once. That would draw attention. Changes were selective, applied to planes flown by pilots who had already proven themselves in combat, men whose survival mattered most. If question mechanics could always point to clean inspection results, the aircraft still met specifications, just closer to the edge than regulations allowed. What made the spread unstoppable was that it required no belief, only observation. Mechanics didn't need to be convinced. They could see the outcomes. Pilots didn't need explanations. They could feel the difference the moment they moved the controls under pressure. Success became the only argument that mattered. Commanders noticed improvements but struggled to explain them. Engagement reports showed better outcomes. Loss rates declined in certain units without obvious changes in tactics. Analysts searched for causes at higher levels: leadership, training, morale. Never suspecting that the real shift was happening inside control systems they assumed were unchanged. By the time questions began circulating at higher levels, the modification was already embedded across multiple aircraft, sometimes removed for inspections and reinstalled afterward, sometimes disguised so well It blended into existing components. It became part of the aircraft's identity without ever becoming part of its documentation. The most dangerous aspect of this silent spread wasn't mechanical. It was institutional. It exposed the truth no organization likes to confront. The system designed to ensure safety had become an obstacle to survival. The people closest to the problem adapted faster than the structure meant to oversee them. An adaptation breeds confidence. Pilots who trusted their aircraft flew more aggressively. Mechanics who saw their work save lives took responsibility seriously. The entire unit began operating with the quiet understanding that the official version of reality no longer matched the real one. Eventually, something like this always reaches a breaking point. When results improve enough, someone starts asking the wrong questions. Inspectors notice inconsistencies. Engineers see data that doesn't align with expectations. The quiet space where the modification lived begins to shrink. When that happened, there would be no hiding behind anonymity. Credit, blame, and consequences would finally surface or be deliberately buried. The shift in the battle didn't arrive with a declaration or a turning point headline. It arrived quietly, buried inside numbers that few people looked at closely enough to question. Loss ratios improved. Mission success rates crept upward. Pilots started coming back more often than they didn't. And because wars are loud, chaotic things, no one stopped to ask why the change felt so sudden. From the outside, it looked like momentum. Commanders attributed it to experience. Analysts pointed to improved coordination. Briefings credited better discipline and tactical refinement. Every explanation fit comfortably inside the existing narrative, which made them easy to accept. No one wanted to believe that something so critical was happening outside official channels. But on the flight line, the truth was obvious. Aircraft that had been written off as difficult or unforgiving were now behaving differently in combat. Pilots who had survived by luck were now surviving by control. Engagements that once ended in defensive retreats were turning into offensive opportunities. The air didn't feel owned by the enemy anymore. What made this moment unique was that the people responsible for the change had no interest in recognition. Mechanics weren't seeking praise. Pilots weren't filing special reports. Everyone involved understood that attention could end the one thing that was working. Silence was protection. As a result, the improvement became institutional without ever being acknowledged. New pilots arrived and absorbed the changed reality without knowing why it existed. They learned to fly aircraft that responded the way aircraft were always supposed to respond. To them, the earlier losses seemed inexplicable, almost exaggerated. History was being rewritten in real time, not through documentation, but through survival. The enemy, meanwhile, was losing something more valuable than aircraft. They were losing predictability. Every failed engagement forced them to set tactics that had defined their success. They began breaking off attacks earlier. They avoided situations they once sought out, and every adjustment they made created new vulnerabilities. This wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was erosion. Confidence wore down one engagement at a time. Pilots stopped trusting instincts that had once kept them alive. That hesitation fed into outcomes, reinforcing the sense that the sky was no longer theirs to control. Behind the scenes, the system began noticing inconsistencies. Inspectors saw performance improvements that didn't correlate with known changes. Engineers reviewed data that didn't align with expectations. Questions were raised carefully, indirectly, as if no one wanted to be the first to pull on a thread that might unravel something inconvenient. Because if the truth surfaced fully, it would expose an uncomfortable reality. that a war-critical advantage had been created by someone without authority, without approval, and without official blessing. A single decision had outpaced the system designed to manage decisions. And systems don't like being outpaced. What followed wasn't punishment or praise, but something far more common in wartime institutions. Quiet absorption. The results were kept. The cause was blurred. Credit dissolved into anonymity. The battle continued under new assumptions, while the origin of those assumptions faded into the background. By the time the war moved on and priorities shifted, the question of who changed the fight no longer mattered. The change had already been normalized. The unofficial fix had become part of how the battle was remembered without ever being named. And that is how history often loses its most important actors. Not because their actions were small, but because acknowledging them would complicate the story too much. One final question remained, though. What does this say about how wars actually change? And who really changes them? The uncomfortable truth behind this story is not about aircraft, mechanics, or even innovation. It is about how wars truly change, and how rarely that change comes from where history expects it to come from. Official narratives prefer clean lines. They favor generals, doctrines, and sanctioned breakthroughs. They tell stories where progress is planned, approved, and implemented through orderly chains of command. But real war is disorderly. It exposes flaws faster than institutions can respond. And when systems lag behind, reality survival depends on individuals who act before permission arrives. This battle did not turn because of a new aircraft model or a revised tactical manual. It turned because someone without authority recognized that the rules no longer matched the battlefield. The mechanic did not overthrow doctrine out of arrogance. He did it out of proximity. He lived close enough to the problem to see what abstraction hid. While others interpreted data, he interpreted consequences. What? Marquise? This moment's significance is not the modification itself, but what it reveals about power in wartime. The most decisive leverage often exists at the lowest levels where reality is felt directly. The closer someone is to friction, fear, and failure, the more accurately they understand what needs to change. Distance creates blindness. Proximity creates clarity. This is why institutions struggle to capture these moments honestly. Acknowledging them means admitting that control was lost and regained outside official structures. It means accepting that obedience at times is less valuable than judgment, and that is a dangerous idea for any organization built on hierarchy. The enemy never fully understood what happened. They adjusted tactics, blamed pilots, questioned training, but they were fighting a shift they could not see. Their defeat was not caused by a superior strategy on paper, but by the collapse of an assumption they relied on without realizing it. When that assumption disappeared, so did their dominance. And the mechanic, he didn't become a legend. His name did not headline reports. His decision didn't enter doctrine under his signature. The war moved on, absorbing the result while discarding the origin. That is not an exception. It is the rule. History often preserves outcomes while erasing the people who made them possible. But the lesson remains, whether it is acknowledged or not. Wars are not changed only by those who command them. They are changed by those who notice what everyone else knows, by those who understand that following rules blindly in a broken system can be more dangerous than breaking them carefully. And that is the final, unsettling reality of this story. The course of an air battle shifted, not because someone was ordered to act, but because someone chose to accept responsibility when the system could not. If you stayed until this moment, you're not just watching history, you're understanding it. Stories like this matter because they reveal how wars are actually shaped, not by clean plans or official speeches, but by human decisions made under pressure, far from the spotlight. If this story changed the way you see military history, leave a comment right now with the phrase, "Unofficial decisions win wars." That tells me you followed the entire journey and helps this video reach people who care about real, untold moments like this. Make sure you hit the like button if you value deep, factual, high-retention war stories that go beyond textbooks, and subscribe to the channel if you want more hidden moments were overlooked. Individuals quietly changed the course of battles and conflicts.